With this pandemic, we've been faced with the most dramatic and immediate collapse of the economy in our lifetime. And it's hit on some levels that are more challenging to deal with than any recession we've had before, including the Great Depression. Because of this, there is no standard playbook we can resort to for answers. The types of interventions that might have been used in the past cannot work this time. Jobs programs would not work because of the need for social distancing, and businesses already have more than enough incentive, so something like a tax cut wouldn't help. If this crisis passes within 2 to 3 months, we will probably bounce back quickly. Even in 4 to 6 months, a reasonable recovery may still be possible. But otherwise, we may very well suffer a severe economic depression. Millions of people would not be able to pay their rent, mortgages, or handle the most basic and necessary day-to-day living expenses. Many businesses will not survive. In this video, I'm going to consider a worst-case scenario and present an alternative government strategy to mitigate the fallout. And if this crisis ends up resolving itself with only moderate damage, then perhaps this will offer useful ideas for the future. Our government appropriately implemented an economic stimulus program, which is focused primarily on giving out various forms of emergency funding, along with some other strategies that we'll examine. Initially, this was definitely the right course of action to take. This crisis came on abruptly and hit very hard, so people and businesses needed the immediate lifeline. But in the longer term, we have to be very concerned whether running these kinds of ongoing, exorbitant deficits is sustainable or not. This will end up costing many trillions of dollars, especially if the crisis is extended. And in actuality, this approach doesn't reflect the new reality that we've been living in. There has been a very genuine collapse of economic activity. Millions have lost income. Businesses have closed. But instead of dealing with this change directly, we're trying to fill in the impossibly large hole that has resulted. We need to find a different way to respond, which is more cost-effective and sustainable. We can shift our strategy to one that relies more heavily on lowering people's and businesses' most crucial expenses. Simply put, every dollar in expenses that we save someone is a dollar that we won't need to send out in stimulus. If we can do this successfully, it should be sustainable over a significantly longer period of time. And perhaps most importantly, we can hopefully minimize the worst ravages to society and individuals that result from a deep depression, like homelessness, hunger, or the loss of health care. A large amount of cash stimulus would still be needed, but we can conserve some of those resources for more potent uses later on. This same approach is essentially what our government has been trying to do already by suspending mortgage payments or placing a moratorium on evictions. The basic strategy behind this approach is that income and expenses are just two sides of the same challenge that people have to budget for. There is no difference between giving someone $1,000 in income or saving them $1,000 in their key expenses. While obviously we won't be able to do this perfectly in every respect, if people could theoretically eliminate all their essential day-to-day living expenses, then they could at least tread water acceptably, without the intense stress and depravity that an economic depression would bring. I believe we need to go all in on this strategy and find every way we can to reduce people's most essential expenses. Some people and businesses will be able to manage without the need for support. But for the large number of others, we should try to help them maintain an acceptable quality of living, hopefully with the same roofs over their heads, their utilities running, with decent food and water, quality education, and acceptable health care. This would be much better than the conditions we'd expect during a deep economic depression, and would help us feel that society is holding together. This plan won't do anything to address the vacuum left in consumer spending. That is a crucial topic, but one that can be discussed separately. This is one perfect example of where cash stimulus might be used to much greater effect. No matter how ridiculous or impossible any of these proposals may seem, they at least offer a sense of the realistic scope of interventions we need to consider. So, if you have some expertise and disagree with anything, be specific about what problems you see, and more importantly, come up with alternatives that could have a chance of meeting the challenges we face. Hopefully, this will not happen, but it could. So, we should be thinking this through. The phrase, "we are at war," is thrown around a lot these days, but we don't really give it much attention. It's absolutely crucial that we get how serious this crisis may become. We need to think of it in nearly that literal sense, in order for all the separate interests to pull together and stay focused. So, take this message seriously. This is a war. The nature of the attack and strategies used are different, but the spirit necessary to fight them is absolutely the same. During World War II, everyone concentrated on the fight at hand, but they had major psychological advantages that we don't. Each of us is mostly dealing with this on our own. We don't have bombs being dropped on us, and there's no specific evil enemy for us to fight against. So, we have to use some mental tricks to bring out that same kind of resolve. Thinking of it as a war is part of igniting that attitude. Consensus has to happen at all financial levels. Elements of this strategy rely heavily on the cooperation of various wealthy individuals, corporations, and members of the financial sector. So is it completely ridiculous to believe that hugely profitable people and businesses would ever go along with this? Actually, maybe they will. And here are some reasons why. Public sentiment has already risen to dangerous levels regarding extreme wealth disparity and the failures of capitalism. Sticking rigidly to this system while social distress peaks even higher might result in much worse consequences for them. There is a simmering anger, and this can lead to major social upheavals. These plans support systemic capitalism by having it function better. Our economic system simply cannot maintain itself without sufficient levels of broad-based prosperity and low unemployment. Heroism and patriotism are contagious. Successfully framing this as a war that we are fighting together will greatly increase their likelihood of compliance. Peer pressure is also a very powerful influence. If enough key players support this, others will feel more compelled to do so as well. We are now going to look at how it might be possible to dramatically lower a couple of key expenses for individuals and maybe for some businesses as well. The first CARES stimulus bill improved substantially on mortgage assistance, but still only offered help for federally backed loans. Government is also in talks with private lenders in hopes of convincing them to provide some assistance as well. On the state and local levels, there's a patchwork of protections for some renters with freezes and moratoriums on evictions that vary depending on location. These are only partial attempts to use the same strategy that I'm suggesting we do more comprehensively. But these plans still face significant hurdles. Negotiations involve a complicated chain of individuals and entities, including mortgage bondholders, financial lenders, and large or small property owners. Smaller landlords are also particularly susceptible to cash flow disruptions since they typically work with relatively slim operating margins. And none of these plans seem definitively pinned down. So altogether, people are left without confirmation and a great deal of ongoing uncertainty and stress. So then, how could we approach this any differently? This is why I first spoke about the psychology of war and why we might also get big financial players to come on board with these plans. These are crucial elements to achieving success. To further increase the chances of cooperation from everyone with monetary concerns, I think it needs to be clear how it's actually in their own interest to work out some kind of pragmatic solution. So then, what would be the outcome if we stuck to our standard playbook, even if things continued to spiral downward? Millions of people without jobs will eventually lose their homes, and renters will get evicted. Along with the surge of homelessness, there will be a huge oversupply of housing. This will cause prices to fall dramatically, leaving private homes and rentals vacant or with deeply lowered value. The same problems will occur with commercial properties. Massive closings will lead to a huge oversupply and a collapse in prices for those spaces. As a result of the precipitous fall in rental income, landlords for both private and commercial properties will often be unable to meet their obligations and be forced to default as well. Primary lenders will end up being stuck with many of these properties sitting on their books. Investors holding these mortgage-backed securities will suffer huge losses when these bonds collapse unless they're fully insured. So, as an alternative approach, what if we could put a freeze on some or all of the amount due on mortgage payments, and at every level, even for commercial or multiple property owners, if occupants were unable to fully make their regular payments? And what if we could even extend this over a fairly longer time period? Without this lifeline, the collapse would only be propelled further and faster, causing more pain for everyone. Some individuals and businesses may then be able to resume with a restructured payment schedule. For those that failed, well, that money to the property owners was lost anyway, and no one would be there to fill the vacancy either. For lenders and bondholders, the total amount due on these surviving mortgages would remain intact. Payments would have only been temporarily suspended, and new revised terms could be negotiated. So not as much of a loss here. Landlords would also have some degree of leniency with their mortgage payments, helping them to keep some of their commercial or individual tenants in place and reducing damages to the property owner's business. If further gaps in payment still needed to be filled, government may then have more resources left to offer cash subsidies. The end result could be a win-win for everyone, or actually less of a lose-lose. This same structural approach could also be used to help stabilize auto and student loan defaults. Overall, this could dramatically reduce the damaging ripple effects that would be felt throughout the economy. And the economy would be in a much better position for a possible recovery. Millions of people have already lost their employer-sponsored health care. These people, and many others, will not be able to afford coverage for long, and it will most likely continue to get worse. Even those with insurance could face whopping medical bills. Just with modest downward projections, this impending catastrophe cannot be overstated. So, where does that leave us? First, I want to briefly confront the topic of American healthcare insurance as it stands now. Overall, America has the worst health insurance system among all the advanced industrialized countries. It functions exceptionally well for anyone with solid coverage, but what it offers to the general public is a national embarrassment. And with massively growing unemployment, this failure of our system will also become much more painful and costly. For countries that have nationalized healthcare, they are much better prepared to weather a deep crisis like this. But something very positive can be salvaged from all this, if we have the will to take advantage of the genuine opportunity this disaster has provided. Americans in general are angry. We want real, meaningful healthcare reform. And thanks especially to Bernie Sanders, as well as the Affordable Care Act, the national debate has completely shifted. So with passions running especially high right now, we should make a push with everything we've got. That itself would be monumental. Every person and organization that's involved in this fight needs to agree that the time is now and pool their efforts into one gigantic surge. That is the only way it will ever get done. If a global depression does kick in, though, even countries with socialized healthcare will be under a lot of pressure and their systems may eventually buckle. They rely on tax revenues, and these will be severely depressed. So, we're left with the same question. How do we handle a crisis this severe? Here are some thoughts. Once again, this is a war. We're all in this fight together. We need that degree of motivation and attitude. And for this part, it's the most successful businesses in healthcare that will have to step up. Profits cannot be the priority for now. Keeping society healthy has to be the mission. It will take that kind of generosity and heroism. Think about the doctors, nurses, and staff that worked tirelessly without caring about themselves. Could it have been remotely possible without that kind of selflessness? Our objective should also be to provide a standard level of high-quality healthcare for everyone without exception. No one should be left behind. Treating each other equally would help build a sense of unity. And it's also much easier to organize around that principle. Trying to figure out where to draw lines makes it much more complicated and questions our morals. On an actual battlefield, any of this would be obvious. Getting our goals and priorities aligned would make it possible to take specific economic measures required to lower costs drastically. The price for everything we buy is marked up many times over, from the actual cost to manufacture a product or provide a service. And this is fine in normal times. It's how our system works. That markup pays for a lot of things along the way. But for now, there just isn't enough broad economic strength to support this model. It's been built on an assumption of profits that are not there. The good news is, when it comes to pricing with healthcare, there's an enormous amount of flexibility to reduce costs because huge markups are already embedded in the system for work they've already done. Again, the way our system is set up, these profits are deserved. But we're facing an emergency, and we have to be practical in order to weather this crisis. The basic strategy should be very clear by now. I've just provided a couple of examples to illustrate and give a sense of the kinds of extreme ideas we need to consider. Analyzing each essential living expense will present its own challenges, and whether and to what extent we can lower these costs. It may be difficult or impossible to find ways to do it, but we should give it a 150% effort. These ideas have been made with the assumption that the coronavirus limitations remain, and the crisis hits chronic depression levels. If not, other strategies would be the more appropriate course. Each economic crisis needs to be assessed on its own, and interventions tailored to suit those circumstances. And not only the economic tools, but also the timing of when to apply them is a key aspect that we don't consider enough. We will need to look at the situation as it progresses and when the crisis clears. Are people straddled with crippling debt? Would cash injections at that time be more likely to spark consumerism? Would a jobs program be the right solution? There are just too many variables to consider. So, we should cross those bridges when we come to them.